Beitunia, West Bank. The 2nd of June, 2005. For 3 years, the man in that doorway had slept in a different house every night and had carried no telephone. But on that afternoon, he stood still, in daylight, in front of 200 witnesses. Because the Israeli government had published the date his eldest son would walk out of prison. 15 years earlier, the same government had taken the boy at 17. Now it was handing him back on a schedule and building an operation around the one appointment his father would never miss. 4 attempts had already failed. This was Operation Lintel. Welcome to Agent Uncovered. Subscribe and stay with us to the end of this one. The ending is the part that argues with itself. Nablus, April 2002. The Israeli army had entered the city on the 3rd, and when it left, the old quarter counted 64 buildings destroyed or badly damaged, and as many as 221 damaged in part. Among them were 260 historic houses, 3 historic mosques, and 7 Roman cisterns. Between April and November of that year, the city lived under curfew for 151 days. In the covered lanes of the old quarter, where some alleys never see direct sun at all, the dust from collapsed vaulting sat on the stone for months. A man in his late 40s walked out of that city and did not walk back into a fixed address for the rest of his life. His name was Mohammed Rashad Sawalha. Until 1994, he had been an engineer in the Nablus Municipal Water Department, a salaried man with a desk, a route to work, and a telephone on which he could be reached. Everything in that sentence became, over the following decade, a liability he removed one item at a time. By 2002, he held no post that could be entered in a register. He was an operations commander in a section of the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, covering the corridor between Nablus and Tulkarem. And the Israeli file on him contained exactly one photograph, a municipal identity card portrait taken when he was 39. Everyone called him Abu Anas. It is worth being precise about that name, because the whole of this story turns on it. In Arabic naming practice, a man is commonly known by the name of his eldest son. Abu Anas means simply, the father of Anas. He had carried it since 1973. By 2002, it was the only name most of the men around him used, and almost none of them had ever asked where Anas was. The discipline he built was not improvised. He carried no mobile telephone at all on any network. And in the West Bank in those years, there was only one, Jawwal, which had opened its service on the 2nd of October, 1999. He moved between houses, most nights a different one, and he never chose which house himself. He accepted no invitation that could be written into a diary. He did not attend weddings. He did not attend funerals, including 2 in his own extended family. He had not been photographed since 1998. The man who enforced all this was 34 years old and was called Wasim Kanadilo. He selected the houses, moved the bedding, screened the visitors, and set the hours. In 3 years, he had not made a single error that any Israeli file could identify. The Israelis knew his first name before they knew his face, and they came to regard him, in the flat language of assessment, as the principal obstacle. By the winter of 2004, the picture in Tel Aviv was complete and useless. They knew what Abu Anas did. They knew roughly where he did it. They had a photograph of a younger man with a municipal water department lanyard around his neck. What they did not have and could not construct was a single moment in the future when they could say with confidence where he would be standing. The file on Abu Anas sat in 2 buildings, and the reason for that is the first thing this story has to explain, because it is not a detail. It is the shape of everything that follows. Mossad, founded in December 1949, is Israel's foreign service. Its remit is collection and covert action outside Israel, and its structure is built for that. A collections division running case officers abroad, a special operations division, a political liaison arm. Inside the West Bank, it has no standing. The internal service, the Israel Security Agency, known everywhere as Shin Bet, owns that ground through its Arab Affairs Department, and it was Shin Bet, under Avi Dichter through the whole of this period, that identified targets in the territories. The strikes themselves were flown by the Israeli Air Force. In every documented targeted killing in the West Bank and Gaza in those years, that is the chain. The Foreign Service does not appear in it. So the file was split, and the split was formal. In the Internal Service, it belonged to a district coordinator for the Nablus area named Zachi Ben Ami, working under the codename Stone Chat. He owned the village, the sources, the checkpoints, and the pattern of life. In the Foreign Service, it belonged to a case officer named Eyal Rotem, codename Lapwing, and what Rotem owned was the reason there was a file at all. Because Abu Anas was not a local bomb maker. He was the West Bank end of a procurement and money line that began outside Palestine altogether. In a trading company in the Gulf, in transfers routed through a charity's accounts in Europe, in a courier route that ran up through Amman and came apart into small pieces before it reached the Jordan Valley. Hamas had run a political bureau outside Palestine since 1996. And the split between that bureau and the local commanders was real and structural. Rotem had spent 3 years reading the foreign half of one man's life. He had never seen the man. He could tell you, within a fortnight, when Abu Anas would next need to move money. He could not tell you which house he would sleep in tonight. And Ben Ami, who could sometimes tell you the house, had no idea why any of it mattered strategically. Neither half could close the file alone. That was the arrangement, and it was less elegant than it sounds. 2 services, 2 chains of authority, 2 sets of assumptions about what the operation was for. Between 2002 and 2004, they tried 4 times. The details of the 4 attempts are of a piece. Twice the target was reported in a house and had left before the reporting was confirmed. Once a movement window closed because the corridor between 2 villages was sealed for reasons that had nothing to do with him. The 4th was aborted by the coordinator himself, at the point of decision, because the confirmation he had was 1 source and 1 source only. And the assessment written afterwards used the phrase insufficient discrimination, meaning that on the information available, they could not have guaranteed they were killing the man they intended to kill. The easy method was closed to them, and it had been closed for a decade. On the 5th of January, 1996, the Hamas bomb maker Yahya Ayyash had been killed by a mobile telephone containing roughly 15 grams of explosive, detonated remotely after his voice was confirmed on an intercept. The operation was a Shin Bet success, and it was also permanently a Shin Bet problem. Every serious commander in the territories learned the same lesson from it on the same day. After Ayyash, no one who mattered carried a telephone, and a man who carries no telephone cannot be found by listening. He can only be found by watching. And Abu Anas had spent 3 years making sure there was nothing to watch. There is a second track to this story, and it had been running for 12 years before anyone in Israeli intelligence noticed it. In 1990, a 17-year-old from Beit Furik was arrested and charged. His name was Anas Muhammad Sawalha. The offenses he was convicted of were serious, and they were not lethal. No one had died. He was sentenced to 15 years. In the summer of that year, he was a boy who had never held a job. When the sentence was handed down, he had a release date in 2005, which at 17 is not a date. It is a rumor about a stranger. He was held in the security prison system, which through those years meant a set of facilities in the north and the south of Israel. The most punishing of them was Katziat in the Negev, 72 kilometers southwest of Beersheba, known to Palestinians as Ansar III. It had opened in March 1988, closed in 1995, and reopened in April 2002 to absorb the detentions of that spring. In 2002 and 2003, it held around 1,000 men, most of them in tents holding 20 each, inside compounds ringed by walls 5 meters high, in a desert that is furnace hot by day and cold enough at night to be its own punishment. The person who made the journeys was his mother. Nawal Sawalha was known as Anas, the mother of Anas, by the same custom that gave her husband his name. For 15 years, she did the work that nobody writes down. She dealt with the lawyers. She dealt with the Prisoners Association in Nablus and later in Ramallah. She dealt with the Red Cross, which organized family visits and which, in the worst years of the closure, was sometimes the only institution that could move a Palestinian woman from a hill village to a prison in the Negev and back. When the permits were refused, she waited and applied again. She had 2 other children who grew up around the absence. Bilal, the younger brother, was 11 when Anas was taken. By 2005, he was 26 and teaching in the village school. Rasha was born after the arrest. She was 23, married in Nablus, and had met her older brother only across a visiting room table at intervals set by other people. And there was a father who, from 1994 onward, could not go anywhere near a prison gate. To apply for a visit is to give a state your name, your identity number, your address, and a date on which you will be standing in a specific place. Abu Anas had spent a decade removing exactly those 4 things from the world. He had not seen his son since the boy was 17 years old. On the 6th of August, 2003, Israel released 331 Palestinian prisoners as a gesture under the roadmap framework. The family in Beit Furik followed the lists. Anas Sawalha was not on them. 2 criteria governed who was and was not released in those years, and both were published. A prisoner had to have served at least 2/3 of his sentence, or to be held for lesser offenses. And no prisoner with, in the Israeli formulation, blood on his hands would be freed at all. At the time, those were words in a newspaper. Nobody in the family understood that they were also a sorting mechanism, which would in less than 2 years place the father and the son on opposite sides of the same filing system, and then bring them together in one doorway on one afternoon. Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, the 8th of February, 2005. Ariel Sharon and Mahmoud Abbas sat down with Hosni Mubarak and King Abdullah of Jordan and declared a mutual end to violence. Nothing was signed. The Second Intifada, which had begun in September 2000, was not formally concluded. It was announced as finished by 2 men standing beside each other. Among the commitments Sharon made was a number, and the number was the reason this operation exists. 900 Palestinian prisoners would be released. 500 immediately. 400 more within weeks. 9 days later, at a desk in Tel Aviv, an analyst named Hila Vaknin was doing the least glamorous work in the building. Her code name in the file was Turnstone, which she found funny because a turnstone is a bird that walks along a shoreline flipping over stones to see what is underneath. And that was, with some precision, the whole of her job. She had been given the draft release schedule, names, prison, district, sentence length, release point, and instructed to run it against the Internal Service's own target holdings. The purpose was defensive. The service wanted to know whether it was about to free anybody it would regret freeing. It was housekeeping. Every release in those years produced the same anxiety in the same building, and the anxiety had a shape. 900 names, compiled by one service, approved by a cabinet. And nobody wanted to be the analyst who had signed off on a page containing a man they had spent 4 years trying to kill. So the schedule went round the target holdings the way a guest list goes round a security desk, and it was expected to come back with a handful of queries and no surprises. She was 3 days into the schedule when she found the same surname twice on one page. Anas Muhammad Sawalha, Beit Furik, Nablus District. Sentenced 1990, 15 years. Eligible under the 2/3 provision, no lethal offense. Cleared for release. Muhammad Rashad Sawalha, Beit Furik, Nablus District. Active target file, 4 attempts, no fixed location, no telephone, no photograph after 1998. Known as Abu Anas. It took her the rest of the afternoon to be certain, because certainty in that building means paper. She pulled the family registration. She pulled the prison visit records, which are a complete inventory of who cares about a prisoner and how much, and found 15 years of a mother's applications and not one from a father. She pulled the target file's summary sheet and read the kunya out loud to herself. The father of Anas. Everybody in the corridor between Nablus and Tulkarem had been saying the son's name aloud several times a day for 15 years, and no one on either side had heard it as information. The assessment she wrote that evening ran to under a page. Its central paragraph observed that the subject had removed every predictable element from his own life, and that the state was now about to create one for him. A date, a place, and an obligation, all 3 of them published, none of them his to move. Ben-Ami read it the following morning. Rotem read it in a different building the same day, and the 2 of them met inside 72 hours. Rotem's contribution to that meeting was a single confirmation, and it came from the other end of the world. In his own holdings, going back to 2002, were 3 separate references from the foreign side of the courier route to a man identified only by a kunya. He had logged them as an unresolved identity for 3 years. Placed beside a family registration from a village east of Nablus, they resolved in about 4 minutes. 2 services had been reading 2 halves of the same name, and neither had thought to say it out loud to the other. What was in front of them was not a route or a habit. It was an appointment, and it had been made by their own government in public as a gesture of peace. 2 years earlier, in the spring of 2003, a building contractor from Beit Furik had sat in a room on the Israeli side of a checkpoint and been told that his daughter's file was still under review. His name was Ghassan Halawa. He was 42 then, 44 by the time this story reaches him. He had married into the Sawalha family 2 decades earlier and was related to Abu Anas by marriage in the way that half a village of 15,000 people is related to the other half. He was not political. He built houses badly and cheaply for people who could not afford better. His youngest daughter had a cardiac condition requiring a procedure that could not be performed in Nablus. It could be performed on the other side of a checkpoint. And to reach that side, she required a permit. And the permit required an application, and the application required an interview. The pattern is documented, and it is documented widely. The system of Israeli movement permits for work, for entry to Jerusalem, for family reunification, and above all for medical treatment unavailable in the territories, created a continuous supply of Palestinians in acute need, standing in front of Israeli officials with discretion, Physicians for Human Rights in Israel documented 32 cases of sick Gazans who said they were refused exit permits after declining to become informants. Israeli press reporting documented approaches to Palestinian medical students, with entry permits to Jerusalem conditioned on cooperation. Halawa was not threatened in that room. Nobody in that system needs to threaten anyone. He was told the file was under review, and that reviews take time, and that he seemed like a man who understood how a village works. He said yes in June. The permit was issued 11 days later. The procedure was successful. He was not paid enough for it to matter. That is deliberate, and it is standard. A source who is paid well can be identified by what he suddenly owns, and a source who is paid well starts to think of himself as a professional, which makes him harder to control. A source who is paid almost nothing, and who came in through a hospital rather than a bank, remains what he was recruited as: a frightened man with an obligation he cannot discharge. For 2 years afterwards, he reported nothing that could have killed anybody. He described weddings. He described who was cooking for whom, which families had fallen out, whose son had gone to work in Ramallah, which houses were empty. In the trade, this is called domestic reporting, and it is treated with mild contempt right up until the moment it becomes the only thing that matters. In late February 2005, Ben Ami retasked him. The instruction he received was almost insultingly small. He was to find out what the Sawalha family was planning for the return of the eldest son, and to keep finding out, week by week, for as long as it took. Nothing about the father, nothing about the brigades, nothing about weapons, houses, or movements. Just the arrangements for a homecoming, who was invited, where the tent would go, who would drive, who would cook. The second source was quieter and cheaper. In a Palestinian prisoner's affairs office in Ramallah, there was a clerk named Nasri Tufaha, 33 years old, who handled release correspondence and saw names before they were public. He had not been recruited by threat and had never been asked for anything he considered serious. He had been cultivated across 5 years of small favors and one debt that had been quietly settled by a man he believed to be a Jordanian businessman. Tufaha supplied the schedule. Halawa supplied the afternoon. Between them, without either man ever reporting a single fact about Abu Anas, they were building the most accurate prediction of his movements that anyone had achieved in 3 years. The planning that followed took place almost entirely on paper, in 2 rooms, and it consisted of working out a journey that had not happened yet. Start at the end of it, which is where the planners started. Beit Furik sits east of Nablus. A village of around 15,000 people approached through winding olive groves, with stone and breeze block houses on a slope, flat roofs carrying black water tanks, terraced olives falling away below, and cereal fields on the flatter ground toward the Jordan Valley. Its land was recorded in the survey of 1945 at 36,663 dunams, of which 2,000 were olive groves. It has one road out. Since 2001, that road has passed through a checkpoint established for pedestrians and vehicles, with short opening hours and slow, difficult transit, controlling movement to and from Nablus for the residents of Beit Furik and neighboring Beit Dajan, roughly 20,000 people sharing a single gate. Ben Ami's team wrote that sentence at the top of the operational summary, because a gate that governs a village also governs everyone arriving at it. Now the journey. Released prisoners in that era came out through a small number of fixed points. For the West Bank, the point was the Beitunia checkpoint beside Ophir, 4 kilometers from Ramallah, on land taken from the town of Beitunia. Ophir had reopened on the 29th of March, 2002, the same day the siege of the Muqata'a compound began. And through this whole period, it was run by Israeli military police, with a military court operating out of trailers rather than a building. Releases were processed before dawn, a deliberate flattening of the occasion, timed to keep the crowd small. From Beitunia to Beit Furik, the road crosses the entire architecture of the occupation. Ramallah to Nablus alone is 36 kilometers in a straight line and 48 by road, and the village sits beyond Nablus on the far side of the city. Out of Ramallah, north onto Route 60, the two-lane spine that runs 235 kilometers from Beersheba to Nazareth, through terraced limestone hills with no shoulder. Through the junction at Zatara, where Route 60 meets Route 505, closed to Palestinian traffic entirely from 2000 until 2003 and permit only thereafter. Then Huwara, immediately south of Nablus, established in October 2000 and among the busiest checkpoints in the West Bank. And after 2002, only 6 checkpoints admitted anyone into Nablus at all, with men between 16 and 45 requiring permits obtained outside the city. Then through or around the city and east to the gate. In the closure years, that journey would have been impossible. In June 2005, it was merely very difficult, and the difference was measurable. The United Nations Humanitarian Office counted 680 closure obstacles in the West Bank in November 2004, 605 in April 2005, and 376 by August. The story sits on that downslope. It could not have happened 18 months earlier. Then Major Amihai Golan, the Army liaison, stated the constraint, and it removed most of the options in the room. 3 years earlier, on the 22nd of July 2002, an Israeli F-16 had dropped a 1-ton bomb on a residential block in Gaza City to kill one Hamas commander, and had killed 15 people, 11 of them children. 14 months after that, on the 6th of September 2003, the Air Force used a deliberately downsized 250-kilogram bomb against a Hamas leadership meeting specifically to limit the harm, and the man they were aiming at walked away with minor injuries. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin had been killed by helicopter-fired missiles outside a mosque in March 2004, along with 9 bystanders. Abdelaziz al-Rantisi followed in April. By June 2005, 8 weeks after a declared ceasefire and 10 weeks before Israel evacuated Gaza in front of the world's cameras, nobody was going to authorize a weapon of any size against a village courtyard containing a marquee, a slaughtered sheep, and 200 guests. Golan put it in one line in the minute. Any solution which requires the crowd to be present is not a solution. That sentence defined Operation Lintel. They were not looking for the afternoon. They were looking for the minute inside the afternoon when the afternoon had not started yet. The first tranche went free at dawn on the 21st of February, 2005. 500 prisoners, the largest release in a decade. A Red Cross bus came out of Ofer and turned toward the Beitunia checkpoint in the gray light. The crowd had been forming since 2 in the morning, in the cold, at around 870 meters above sea level, where February nights in that hill country sit close to freezing. There were Palestinian flags, and there were factional flags, green for Hamas, yellow for Fatah, others depending on the man expected. Men came down off the bus into the noise and were lifted onto shoulders. One knelt and put his mouth to the road. Nawal Sawalha was there with her son Bilal. They had traveled the previous day and slept in Ramallah at a cousin's house because there was no possibility of doing the journey and the wait in one morning. Anas Sawalha was not on the bus. He was not on the second bus either, or the third. By 9 in the morning, the crowd had thinned to the families who had not yet accepted the arithmetic, and by noon the point was no longer arguable. The 500 were the first tranche. The 400 were the second, and the second had no date. Ghassan Halawa's report on the following days is one of the coldest documents in the file, precisely because it is not about intelligence at all. He described a house where the sweets bought in advance were left in their boxes. He described Anas going back to the Prisoners' Association in Nablus to ask whether a name could move between lists, and being told, correctly, that nobody in that office had ever known how the lists were made. He described the younger brother taking down a banner he had already had printed. For the operation, the failure of the 21st was not a setback. It was a rehearsal, and it was better than any rehearsal they could have run themselves. They had now watched the whole sequence at full scale with nothing at stake. The pre-dawn processing, the buses, the crowd at Beitunia, the size of it, the noise of it, how long the families took to find each other, how long the road north took on a day when every checkpoint knew a release was happening. They had watched a household in Beit Furik assemble a reception and then dismantle it. And they had learned the one thing that mattered most, which was that the father had not come to Beitunia and would never come to Beitunia, because a release point is an Israeli installation with soldiers on it, and he was not going to walk into one. Whatever this operation was going to be, it was going to happen at the house. In the same week, it also had its own near miss, and it belongs in the record, because it is the only moment in 3 years when the two halves of this story almost touched by accident. On the evening of the 23rd of February, Abu Anas moved through a village less than an hour's drive from his own, on his way to a meeting that Rotem's side of the file had predicted a fortnight earlier from a movement of money. Ben Ami had 2 watchers within reach and a decision to make with about 40 minutes of usable light. He had one source reporting, and one source is what had aborted the 4th attempt in 2004. He let it go. Later that year, in an internal review, someone asked him whether he had let it go because the confirmation was thin or because the release day plan already existed, and he did not want to spend the target on a worse afternoon. Ben Ami's answer is in the file. He said that he had told himself the first thing at the time, and that he had come to believe it was the second. 4 days later, on the 25th of February, a suicide bombing in Tel Aviv killed 5 Israelis. The second tranche was frozen that night. No new date was set. No new date was promised. The political conversation moved to other things, and in Beit Furik, a family that had spent 3 weeks not talking about a homecoming went back to not talking about it for reasons that were now permanent, as far as anyone could see. In 2 offices in Tel Aviv, Operation Lintel was complete, rehearsed, and had nothing to do. This is the part of the story that professionals recognize and audiences rarely see. A plan that cannot execute does not sit still. It decays. Watchers who have been in position for a month become people the neighborhood has started to notice. A source who has been asked the same question every week for 11 weeks starts to wonder why the question does not change. And the longer a file stays open around a family, the more chances there are for one careless requisition, one repeated vehicle, one man who looks at another man for a second too long. Rotem's half of the file went quiet in a different way. Money moves on its own calendar, and the courier route did not care about a Tel Aviv nightclub. So through March and April, the Foreign Service kept reading transfers and shipping paperwork and watching a procurement chain function normally at the far end. It was, in its way, the most frustrating position in the operation. Watching the reason the target mattered continue to matter, week after week, while the only mechanism that could reach him sat frozen behind a political decision nobody in either building had any influence over. Ben Ami's problem through March and April was not the target. It was Ghassan Halawa. Because Halawa had worked out, sometime in the middle of March, what he was actually reporting on. For 2 years, he had told himself a story about the permit in his daughter's heart. And the story had held, because what he handed over was gossip. Now his handler wanted the seating, the catering, the vehicles, and the route, and no other subject at all, for a party that was not going to happen. A man can only fail to draw a conclusion for so long. What stopped him was not conscience and not fear of the Israelis. It was arithmetic, and it ran like this. If he stopped reporting, the stopping was itself a fact, and it was a fact with a date on it, and it would sit in a file next to whatever happened afterwards. If he was ever suspected, and in the territories, suspicion of collaboration does not require proof. It requires only a pattern. The pattern would be that he had talked constantly for 2 years and gone silent in the 11 weeks before the worst day in his wife's family's history. He had a daughter with a repaired heart, 3 other children, and no way out of a village with 1 gate. The only route that kept them alive ran forward. So he kept talking, and he understood, from the middle of March onwards, exactly what he was doing. He was right about the risk. Palestinian society treats collaboration as among the gravest of all offenses, and the factions have carried out public killings of accused collaborators across decades. Al Jazeera reported one in Gaza in October 2004. The consequence is not abstract. It is seizure, interrogation by a faction's own apparatus, a killing, and a family standing destroyed for a generation. Meanwhile, the other side of the village had also begun to move. In April, Wasim Kanadilo started sweeping again, changing houses more often, screening visitors he had known for years, cutting the number of people who knew anything about the commander's movements from 12 to 5. Nobody had told him anything. He had simply looked at a calendar. The reconstruction of what Wasim Kanadilo believed comes from asset reporting, second-hand and incomplete, and it should be read as what it is: an Israeli files account of an argument it did not hear. Sometime in the second half of May, when the second tranche of releases came back into the political conversation, Kanadilo went to his commander and told him he could not go home. The argument he made was the correct one. A release date is a published date. A village with 1 gate is a village with 1 approach. A reception is an announcement of a location, a time, and a guest list. And everyone in the corridor between Nablus and Tulkarem would know within a day of the schedule appearing. Whatever discipline the commander had built over 3 years, the changed houses, the refused invitations, the absent telephone, the 2 funerals he had not attended, would be spent entirely in a single afternoon in his own doorway. He proposed alternatives, and they were sensible. The son could be brought to the father a week later in a house nobody had chosen yet. The father could watch the return from a distance and go to him at night. The father could stay away and send word. Every one of those options was better than the doorway, and Kanadilo knew the counter-argument before he made his case, because it was the same counter-argument that had beaten him at both funerals. A commander who cannot be seen at a family occasion is a commander whose authority in a village of 15,000 people is entirely theoretical. Men in the corridor followed Abu Anas partly because of what he was and partly because of who he was. And the second thing lives in courtyards. Abu Anas said no to all of it. The reason he gave, according to the reporting, was not defiance and had nothing to do with the organization. He said that his wife had made the journey to the prisons for 15 years and he had not made it once, and that he was not going to be absent from the 1 day at the end of it as well. There is one more detail in that reporting, and the operation logged it without comment. In the last week of May, Abu Anas asked a man in the village to find out what size of shoes his son took, because he intended to buy him a pair, and he did not know. The son had been 17 when he was arrested. The father had been keeping a boy's measurements in his head for 15 years and had just realized they were useless. The shoes were bought in Nablus. They were the wrong size anyway. That is the humanizing detail, and it is included here for the same reason the operation logged it. Because the file that recorded it was the file that killed him, and the two things were written by the same people in the same week. Then, in the last days of May, the second tranche came back. Nasri Tufaha saw the schedule on a desk in Ramallah before the families did, which was the entire reason he had ever been cultivated, and it carried one date. The 2nd of June, Halawa had the arrangements out of the house in Beit Furik within hours of the family learning. The marquee going up in the yard on the 1st, the sheep, the coffee, the banner with the boy's photograph on the front wall, the hired bus, and the guest list that had run past 200 names by the evening. And in Tel Aviv, Operation Lintel came off the shelf with 100 hours to run. The 2nd of June, 2005. 0400 hours. Prisoner releases in that era were processed in the dark, and the practice was deliberate. Men were moved out of their compounds in the middle of the night, counted, given back what they had come in with, and put onto buses so that the moment of freedom would land in an empty gray hour rather than in front of a crowd at noon. Anas Mohammed Sawalha came out of a holding compound at Ofer at some point in that hour, 32 years old, having spent 15 years and roughly 4 months in Israeli custody. The last thing he had done as a free man, in 1990, was walk down a village street at 17. The bus was a Red Cross bus, and it took him and the others the short distance from Ofer toward the Beitunia checkpoint, 4 kilometers from Ramallah, on ground that had been Beitunia's farmland before it was a prison. He came out into a country he had last seen under a different set of rules. The Intifada he had missed the beginning and the end of had killed something over 4,300 people. His city had spent 151 days under curfew in a single year, and 4,804 hours of it between June 2002 and September 2004. The barrier he had heard about on the news from a prison tent was now a physical object across the landscape, and every household in the West Bank was watching a Qatari television channel that had not existed when he was arrested, because the Palestinian broadcaster's Ramallah building had been blown up in January 2002. He had gone in when a telephone was a thing on a wall. He came out into the only mobile network the territories had. The crowd had been there since 2. Nawal Sawalha was in it. So was Bilal. So was Rasha, who had driven up from Nablus the previous evening. When the men came down off the bus into the noise, there was a period of some minutes during which none of them could find each other, because the crowd was doing what crowds do at those gates: chanting, pushing, lifting men onto shoulders, holding up photographs of prisoners who were not on the list. At approximately 0620 hours, the family reached each other. What happened in the following 4 minutes is not in any Israeli file, because the source who could have described it was 50 kilometers away in a village, doing the only job he had been given. At 0710, the convoy left. It was 3 vehicles and a hired bus. Green and white Palestinian Authority plates on all 4, which in the West Bank of 2005 was not a registration detail, but a category. Because Israeli vehicles carried yellow plates and a soldier at 200 meters could sort a queue by color alone, and green plates were barred from most of the bypass network. They went north on Route 60 into the heat. June in those hills means effectively no rain at all. Hard high light through the middle of the day, dust on the terraces, and long gold evenings. The convoy carried permits for every man of military age aboard, which had taken Bilal Sawalha 11 days to obtain. At Zatara Junction, they were held for 50 minutes. At Huwara, south of Nablus, they were held again. In 2005, Huwara was not the built terminal it later became. It was concrete blocks, a queue in the sun, soldiers under an awning, and a line of people standing on a road with no shade. The convoy cleared it at approximately 11:40, 07:10 in the morning to 20 past 12. 5 hours and 10 minutes to cross the top half of the West Bank. And in Tel Aviv, in a room with a map on it, the entire operation was now watching a single number. The estimated time at which 4 vehicles carrying 200 people's worth of expectation would arrive at a gate east of Nablus that had never been designed to move anybody quickly. At 12:20 hours, the convoy reached the Beit Furik checkpoint and stopped. There is a version of this story in which somebody in an Israeli operations room reached out and adjusted the throughput of a village gate on a June afternoon. The file does not say that. What the file says is that the convoy was held at the checkpoint for a period recorded as 11 minutes, and that the operation was informed of the hold as it began. Above the village, and above it since first light, was a reconnaissance aircraft. The Israeli army flew unarmed surveillance platforms across the territories throughout this period. The Searcher in its tactical role, and the Hermes 450, which had entered service around 1998 and could stay up for over 20 hours. They carried cameras and a real-time downlink and nothing else. In 2005, no Israeli drone in that theater carried a weapon of any kind. That distinction governed the whole morning. The eyes and the weapon were 2 different aircraft, and the second one could not be anywhere near Beit Furik in advance, because an Apache over a West Bank hill village is visible and audible for kilometers and announces itself to every person underneath it. Watching cost nothing and could run all day. Striking was a decision that had to be taken late, and once taken, could not be hidden. 11 minutes at a gate is nothing. It is the ordinary friction of an ordinary day in that landscape. And any of the 20,000 people who shared that checkpoint would have called it a good crossing. 11 minutes was also, precisely, the difference between the 2 versions of the afternoon. Because 600 meters up the slope, in a house with a marquee in the yard, a banner on the front wall carrying a 17-year-old's photograph, a slaughtered sheep, coffee going round, and something over 200 people in and around the courtyard. A message arrived saying that the bus was held at the gate. Abu Anas had been in the village since 11:40. He had come in on foot through the olive terraces on the western side with 2 men, and had waited in a house belonging to a cousin about 140 meters from his own front door. The plan, insofar as he had one, was to enter the house at the same moment as his son, inside the crush of arrival, when there would be 200 bodies between him and any sightline in the world. The message said 11 minutes. He left the cousin's house at approximately 12:24 and walked the 140 meters to his own. Wasim Kanadilo was not with him. Kanadilo had put himself down at the gate end of the village to watch the convoy in, which was the correct decision, made by a man who had been correct for 3 years. On the one occasion, it did not help. The courtyard was full, and the doorway was not. Everyone who had come was in the yard, under and around the marquee, facing the road, waiting for a bus. Abu Anas came up the side of the house, through the gap between his own wall and his neighbor's, and stood in the doorway of his house, alone, in the open, at midday, in the first week of June, in a hill village with no cloud over it. He was 51 years old. He had not stood still outdoors in daylight in an identifiable location in 3 years. He was there for slightly under 90 seconds. The Israeli account of what happened at approximately 12:26 is 4 lines long and contains no adjectives. The target was observed at the address. Identification was confirmed against the single available photograph and against the source description of clothing. The engagement was authorized and executed. The target was assessed as killed at the scene. There were no other casualties. That is the one operational fact the file states twice, in different sections, in the flat, repetitive way of a document that knows it will be read by lawyers. The convoy cleared the gate at 12:31. The bus came up the hill and into the village with a horn going, which is what they do. And the crowd in the courtyard turned toward the road and began to shout. And Anas Sawalha stepped down off a bus into his mother's arms after 15 years and 4 months. The distance from the road to the doorway of his own house is about 20 meters. He was free for 4 hours and 11 minutes before he understood what had happened in it. By 2 in the afternoon, the marquee in the Sawalha yard, put up the previous day for a homecoming, was being used for a funeral. The mechanics of that transition are almost unbearably practical. The chairs stay. The coffee changes. Sweet coffee for a celebration, unsweetened and bitter for mourning. And somebody has to go and get it. The banner with the 17-year-old's photograph on the front wall came down. The sheep had already been slaughtered and cooked, and it was served because 200 people were in the village. And mourning in that society is also hospitality. Anas Sawalha spent the first day of his freedom receiving condolences for a father he had last seen 15 years earlier, from men who called him by his own name and had been calling his father by it for a decade and a half. The Israeli side said nothing at all. There was no announcement, no claim, and no correction, which was standard. The policy of what Israel called targeted thwarting had been publicly avowed since November 2000, but individual operations were routinely left unattributed. The file recorded a closure, Rotem's half of it, the money and procurement line running abroad, stayed open, because a courier route does not die with the man at the end of it. The Palestinian side did not need an announcement. Within a day, the assumption in Beitunia and in the brigades was the obvious one, and it was correct in structure, if not in detail. The timing was too exact, the information too domestic. Somebody in the village had talked. What followed was the ordinary aftermath of that suspicion in that place, which is to say it was slow, unofficial, and permanent. Nobody was seized. Nobody was killed. A number of men in Beitunia found, over the following year, that they were no longer asked to certain houses, that their work dried up, that their sons were not proposed for certain marriages. Ghassan Halawa was one of them. He stopped receiving contracts in the village in the autumn of 2005 and moved his family to Nablus the following spring, where he worked for a larger firm and was never charged with anything, and never cleared of anything either, because there was no mechanism that could have cleared him. His daughter, the one with the repaired heart, was 11. Nasri Tufaha, the clerk in Ramallah, was never suspected at all. He had handled a document that hundreds of people handled in an office whose entire function was to know about releases before the families did, and there was nothing in his conduct that a review could have found. He continued in the post. Say that part out loud, because it is the part of the method that generalizes. The source who was closest to the family paid for the operation with his life standing, and the source who supplied the actual date paid nothing, because he had only ever touched paper. Wasim Kanadilo survived his commander by an unrecorded period and was replaced in role within weeks. The judgment in the assessment written in Tel Aviv 2 weeks later is the coldest sentence in the entire file, and it is about him rather than about the target. The subject's security practice was not defeated. It was rendered irrelevant by an obligation the subject accepted voluntarily. That assessment, 7 pages long, contains no reference to the sun. It records the release schedule as a collection source, the checkpoint hold as an environmental factor, and the 90 seconds in the doorway as the engagement window. It does not anywhere record that a man walked out of a prison that morning after 15 years, or that the operation had been built on the certainty that his father would come to meet him. It did not need to. That was not an omission. It was the file describing what it was for. The corridor between Nablus and Tulkarem had a new operations commander before the end of the year. That was always going to happen, and the people who ran Operation Lintel knew it in advance. The Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades were organized on a cellular model from their founding in 1991, deliberately built so that even senior figures did not know what other cells were doing, a structure whose entire purpose is to survive the removal of any individual inside it. Killing a commander in that system does not end a capability. It costs the organization an experienced man and several months. So the legacy of this operation was never the death. It was the method, and the method was genuinely new to the people who used it. For 3 years, 2 intelligence services had tried to predict where a man would go and had failed, because he had spent those years making himself unpredictable and had succeeded completely. What broke it was the recognition that a person's movements and a person's obligations are 2 different things, and that the second is far easier to read. Because obligations are written down by institutions in advance, and frequently by the very state that wants him. The most valuable document in the file was not an intercept or a surveillance log. It was a prisoner release schedule produced as a gesture of peace, which is where the argument sits, and it will not resolve. On one side, this was the most precisely limited strike of a campaign that had not been precise. In roughly 6 years of targeted killings from 2000, human rights monitors documented around 339 Palestinians killed in such operations, of whom about 210 were the intended targets, which means well over 100 people who were not. This one killed 1 man in 90 seconds. With a crowd of 200 civilians 600 meters away, and not a scratch among them. Measured against a 1-ton bomb over a residential block in July 2002, it is a different moral universe. On the other side, it was reached by taking a 15-year sentence served by a boy who had hurt nobody, a public commitment made at a peace summit, and a mother's 1.5 decades of prison visits, and treating all 3 as targeting material. Anas Sawalha was not an operative and never became one. He was used, without knowing it, from the moment his name was typed onto a schedule. And the thing that was used was the fact that his father loved him and had not seen him since he was 17. Both of those statements are true. They are true at the same time, and neither one cancels the other. And that is the actual condition of the thing, not a failure to make up one's mind. Here is the question we would put to you, and we would rather have your answer than our own. If a state can kill 1 man instead of 15, but can only do it by turning a family's best day into an ambush, has it become more moral or only more precise? Tell us in the comments, because on this one the comments are usually better than the script. If you want more operations from this era, subscribe and send this to the person you always end up arguing with.